Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the learning playlist. And now, on to our show. For today's lecture, we're going to talk about the state and government. Now, previously in the lecture on basic concepts in political science, we talked about the state as the venue where politics occurs. Now, here we're going to talk about the state vis-a-vis its sister concept of the nation. And this is important as the distinction between them will help us move forward with this course and will help us better understand its usage in the long run. So, we've heard perhaps in the news or in daily conversation that the concept of state and nation is often intertwined, often exchanged with one another, no, interchangeably used with one another. So, let's define clearly what is a state and then what is a nation. So first, let's define state. So the state is a political concept. Usually it refers to not only governments per se, but with the many elements of the state, including people, territory, and sovereignty. Now, when we talk about nation, a nation is more loosely defined, and it's not necessarily bound within the territorial limits of a state. Remember that some nations actually cover many states, like Arabs, for example. No, there are many Arabs within different states in the Middle East. Okay, there are many Filipinos within different countries around the world. So, in this sense, a nation is a group of people bound together by certain characteristics, usually ethnic or cultural characteristics such as social origin, language, traditions, customs, and who identify each other according to these distinguishing factors, no, usually defined by culture and identity. So nation as a concept is an ethnic concept, whereas state is a political concept. But nowadays, there's also the idea of the nation state, wherein nations are often identified with, let's say, with the majority people who live within that state and those who have their culture as the dominant component of the people of that state. Now, that happens. Now, there are good things that happen with that. There's social cohesion, in the case of Japan, for example. But there's also the problem of ultra-nationalism, of excessive pride in one's nationality, no? Such as what happened during the Second World War, and of course how many different states actually emphasize or leverage their nationalistic fervor in order to make war with one another. And so the history of state versus nation is actually very much intertwined, but perhaps we should properly define it so that we can use it in everyday parlance as effectively as we can. So the distinctions between state and nation are primarily political and ethnic, but there are several other distinctions that we need to clarify, such as that a state is not subject to external control, ideally. And then there are they may consist of one or more nations and people. There are many different ethnicities within a state. It doesn't mean that it's all one homogeneous mix, but rather it is a mixture of different cultures. We can even say that states nowadays are expected to be multicultural, and that's what's happening with many places right now, especially in Europe, wherein migration from developing countries, especially by guest workers and their families, have contributed to, let's say, to a unique mix of European and Asian or even African, Middle Eastern cultures. But of course, there are backlashes against it, no? And we have seen that most highlighted, especially in the United States and in the many um, nativist movements in Europe, in particular in Germany and France, and even in the United Kingdom. Okay, and a nation, as I said earlier, may be subjected to external control. It may be under a government that does not particularly represent them or represses them, such as the case of the Rohingya in Myanmar. And there are nations that may be made up of several states. So, how about governments? What do we mean by government versus state? Okay, so a government theoretically is only the agency through which the state expresses its will. The state is a very abstract concept. You do not see, for example, a state walking around, no? And the idea of a state, though it is abstract, is often manifested through government and its many agencies. Okay, given that the government can change, its forms may change, and we have seen our government change from one that is defined by the Marcos dictatorship during the 1972 to 1986 um, Marcos regime. Then but it doesn't mean that the state changes as well, no? But governments can change. The state remains the same because while the state cannot exist without a government, as long as it's present, as long as its many elements are present, it remains to be a state. Okay, so a state needs a government in order for it to become recognized internationally. Remember the fifth element we mentioned in the previous lecture, but did not further discuss. Okay, so it can a state can be recognized if it has a government. But what about if it doesn't have a government? Well, it only remains to be a nation. Okay. So it also begs the question, do we really need government? Why do we need government in the first place? And I think this is a huge question for us, especially now in this time of the pandemic. Okay, a government is needed for two things. First, it is needed for public purposes. There are things that we cannot do as individuals. We cannot do it alone. We need the help of everyone in the community or everyone in the state to contribute so that we can enjoy certain benefits like peace and order, security, and even economic opportunities. So the state is a tool to advance the public welfare. So, government is a tool in advancing public welfare. How about if there is no government? Well, without government, there will be no progress at all. Because, as Thomas Hobbes put it in his book, The Leviathan, the idea of man fighting, fighting with one another without any state not to control but to mitigate the conflict between individual versus individual, man's life would be short, nasty, and brutish or brutal. So there are many forms of government and they have been existing since time immemorial. In the ancient times, perhaps the most popular categorization of governments came from the works of Aristotle, in particular his work on politics. So Aristotle has defined the forms of government according to who rules and how many people rule per se. So first, we have the rule of one, basically monarchy. So final authority is exercised by a single person, and then there are several types of authority, or monarchy. It can be an absolute monarchy, or it can be a limited monarchy, just like what we have in the UK right now, the UK and Japan. Then there is the form of aristocracy, wherein few people privileged people, no, preferably I think these are rich people who are able to exercise authority over the rest of society. The negative or the opposite side of aristocracy, no, it's, let's say, we can call it as its evil twin, is oligarchy, where power is monopolized by a few and not shared. Then we have democracy, or the majority of the people rule, and it can be done via several types, which is direct or pure democracy. And then we have representative democracy or republican democracy, which is done via electing representatives to the legislature or to any body that that the that the government has set up for the purposes of making laws or making policies. So when we categorize, or when we try to think about the types of governments available to us in the present day, we tend to categorize it in this manner. First, we have the categorization on the extent of power that is exercised by the central government or by the national government. So we have a unitary government currently exercised by the Philippine government right now, wherein national and local affairs is actually exercised by the national government or controlled in many ways by the national government. Then we have the United States model of a federal government, wherein states basically have control over their own affairs, and they only come together in times of, let's say, or in certain instances like foreign policy. They conduct a common foreign policy, common trade policy, etc., etc. They are still under one powerful central government. However, this central government has given the federal states the ability to conduct their own local affairs with minimum interference. Okay. Now we have categorization as to the relationship between executive and the legislative. These are, let's say, for example, these are two main organs that we will discuss further in this course. So, two main organs of government. There's a third one that is called the judiciary, but primarily we will talk about the executive and the legislative. So, in the parliamentary form of government, the executive branch, which is usually the powerful decision maker in government, and the legislative branch, though the head of the legislative branch, is one and the same. Usually this happens when a political party has gained a majority or has created a powerful coalition within the legislative branch, the lawmaking branch of government, so that they are selected, or rather they are asked. This is the case of Britain, of the United Kingdom. They are asked to create a government on behalf of the monarch. And so the prime minister is both the head of the executive and legislative branch. Instead of a separation of power, what they have is a fusion of power between executive and legislative. There are certain benefits to this. For example, there's the benefit of, let's say, there's the benefit of oversight from his colleagues in the legislative branch, and that has happened in the past. For example, a prime minister who has been erring, or who has been unpopular for quite some time, may be cast down via a vote of no confidence in the legislative. So that's one advantage. The disadvantage of this kind of government, this parliamentarian government, is that there is a tendency that the affairs of the legislative branch can hinder or greatly affect the executive branch, since you have to remember that the executive branch, the prime minister, is also the head of the legislative, and so his attention may be divided among his vast duties. So there is also the presidential form of government, which is usually found in the United States and copied by the Philippines, its former colony. So the presidential form of government is defined by a separation between the legislative and the executive branch. Okay? So the president is not the head of the executive and the legislative, but rather he is the head of the executive branch. Now there is some advantages to this. For example, the president cannot be, or the president is less likely to be affected by for example political infighting or political disagreements within the legislative branch, since he is separate from them. And usually a president in the American model, no, in the American model of politics, is usually elected, or rather it he is, or he or she is elected by via popular vote, no, via plurality vote. So in this way we can see that the, or majority vote, sorry, in this way we can see that the presidential form of government has a huge, well, has certain huge advantages over parliamentary government, in that the executive can act decisively simply because he is not affected by by conducting affairs or by interfering with the affairs of the legislative, theoretically that is. But there are checks and balances, of course, no? And we will discuss checks and balances at a much later time. Okay, how about the provisional government of 1986? I presume you have known about this since you have studied Philippine history. So between 1987, which is the promulgation of the 1987 Constitution, the one that we use today, um, there has been a provisional government, a temporary government set up immediately after the EDSA revolution of February 1986. So in this provisional government, um, we can categorize it as revolutionary, since it was created outside of the existing constitution, which was back then the 1972 Marcos Constitution. Then, it was installed via people power, which was a unique occurrence in Philippine history, and one that many peoples around the world have tried to replicate, especially in the late 1980s. No? And we can define the provisional government of 1986 as de jure. It was a rightful government because later on it was validated with the ratification of the new 1987 constitution at that time. Okay, so it was found to be rightful per se, rightful via people power. Then it is also considered as de facto, or government in fact, no? So a de facto government, it may exist, it may have all the necessary elements of a state. However, it does not have recognition, in particular, from the family of nations, from other states. And as a matter of fact, de facto governments have existed the world over. And in foreign literature, or rather in international news, these de facto states can be known as shell states. So they are pseudo states, states that are not recognized by the United Nations or by the family of nations. And some of these states still persist with us today. Okay, you can look it up the internet. You can look that up in the internet. Okay. So a de facto state is not founded in accordance with the existing constitution, but it has support from people and effective control over territory by which it exercises power. So it becomes de jure once it gains recognition by the people who are in the locality or in the nation, no? And then recognition by other states or by the community of nations. So the 1986 Constitution, the provisional 1986 Constitution, was a sort of a unique constitution for the Philippines, in the sense that it was created out of the need, out of the emergency of the time. You have to remember that the dictator Marcos had already left the country. Effectively, there was no government right after Marcos left. And so the task of Cory Aquino and his supporters was to create a government, was to organize a government immediately, even if it means they operate outside of the existing 1972 constitution at that time. So in a way, you can see that a revolutionary government is um, is something unique in the way that it is not, its powers are not yet clearly defined. No, so it's also a democratic institution as it has the consent of the people, the the provisional government of 1986, no, with of course their provisional constitution, and then um, it operated until uh, until until February 2nd, 1987, by which time the 1987 constitution has took hold. Okay, so while they were crafting the 1987 Constitution, they used the 1986 Constitution and, of course, the provisional government as a means to carry on government affairs because it is hard to carry on without government. No, can you imagine the chaos that would ensue from a lack of a national government to take the helm in terms of affairs of the state at that time? Okay, so these are my references for this lecture, in particular Hector de Leon's book. Thank you for listening, and any comments that you make in the comment section are most welcome. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.